I was hired by the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway between Christmas 1932 and New Year's 1933. In those days, if you didn't know someone who could pull a few strings for you, it was next to impossible to find work. Mr. P.L. Rapper, a family friend and the NC&StL agent in my hometown of Jackson, Tennessee, pulled the strings for me. Railroad jobs were probably the most difficult to get of all, especially for a Tennessee hillbilly who hadn't even finished school. You have to remember that this was smack in the middle of the Great Depression. On March 27, 1933, I made my first run as an extra board fireman after probation. The day before, I dead-headed to Nashville, where the run would begin. Railroad people have a memory for dates, places, and people, and I recall that March 27th was your typical overcast early spring Tennessee day. We'd be taking a freight all the way to Memphis, through the division point at Brewston, where normally a crew change took place. Years later, the two divisions were combined, but in those days it was the Nashville division from Nashville to Hickman, Kentucky, and the Paducah and Memphis division, the P&M, from Paducah, Kentucky to Memphis. All newly hatched fire boys started out in freight. Only with proven experience and seniority did you move on to the passenger runs. I got the locomotive around 6:30 a.m., fresh from the shops. J2484, number 569, sat alongside the Nashville train shed. My first run as a mainline fireman after probation, and I drew a glider. Gliders were the first 484s in the entire South, and also the smallest. NC&StL superintendent of machinery, and also the Rhodes baseball team manager, C.M. Darden, designed these engines with lateral free play in the forward driving boxes that allowed them to glide through curves effortlessly. The Nashville-Brewston segment was known as the Windy for its many curves. The name NC people gave the J2s was only natural, gliders. There were 5 of them, numbers 565 through 569, built by Alco in 1930. No slogging your guts out here. These babies practically ran themselves. Just keep them full of coal and water, or so everyone said. They really didn't build locomotives any finer than these, and they were the pride of the entire NC until the J3 Stripes and Yellow Jackets arrived in the 1940s. The gliders were equipped with all sorts of other remarkable innovations. Worthington feedwater heater and pump, standard BK stroker, etc. All of this made the fireman's job a snap when compared with the old consolidations and 10-wheelers. The Kane Avenue crew had started the fire as 63 cars of drag freight were being switched in. Just some kindling and some waistcloth rags soaked in kerosene was all that was needed to start the fire. The wood and rags crackled and sputtered the coal to life, like the fire in your furnace, and the aroma of burning bituminous soon mixed with the morning dampness in the air. I climbed the steps to the cab to ensure all was right. Steam gauge, sight glass, air gauges, and lubricator. These would be my tools this day, and I wanted to familiarize myself with each of them. I opened the Franklin fire door with a gloved hand and peered inside. Everything looked good. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen thermometer on the wall of the cab showed 50 degrees, but I knew that soon the cab of the 484 would seem like a sauna. The steam gauge showed no pressure, but I could make out the sound of the water in the boiler beginning to boil. At the end of the previous run, water had been pumped into the cooling boiler, so there'd be enough for the next steam up. The water column sight glass showed 4 nuts. Both sides of the glass provided rudimentary graduations. Climbing down outside again, I began to oil around. On a 484, like any steam locomotive, there were a myriad of places to squirt the life-giving lubricant. In order to withstand the high temperatures of the locomotive, the oil in the long-spouted can was extremely viscous, about the consistency of honey. There's nothing in the world like the mingled smell of hot oil and steam, and if you've ever smelt it, you know what I'm talking about. It's a smell you never forget. I walked around and dripped oil into the necessary places. The numerous small holes, cups, and oiling points on the rods and the Walschaerts valve gear each got a few drops, and the driving boxes got their share of oil as well. Of course, the flange oilers and the Nathan mechanical lubricators would do their work once in motion, but not everywhere, and the old hands had taught me that there was no substitute for seeing to things personally before a run. The thick oil took time to dispense, but I knew that it would flow better later on, after I stowed the can near the backhead where it would heat up. I continued to oil with the thick stuff. Some of the places that needed oil were hidden by the counterweights of the driving wheels. I'd have to leave these places until the engine moved and the drivers rotated out of the way. The drops hitting the back of my neck told me that rain had begun. Back in the cab, things were progressing. The sound of boiling water was much louder, and I reached out to tap the steam gauge a couple of times. It was still on 0. A few minutes later, I tapped again. Nothing, but I waited and watched. Finally, almost imperceptibly, the needle rose off the pin. We had steam pressure, but not enough to do anything with yet. Soon the pressure was high enough that I could start some of the accessories. The first thing to do was start the blower. The blower was a pipe running from the steam dome to the smoke box through the boiler shell. It entered the smoke box and shot a jet of steam up the stack. This drew the hot gases through the flues, helping the engine to steam, keeping smoke out of the cab and starting the draft. Steam had condensed into water in the blower since the last steam up, and that water first had to be expelled. I opened a secondary valve near where the blower entered the firebox, and then the main blower valve. Steam and water rushed out onto the ground. When nothing but steam emanated from the pipe, I closed the valve and the jet of steam rushed up the stack in a whooshing sound. Next, steam was admitted to the Nathan hydrostatic sight feed lubricator. 4 feeds would lubricate the piston valve and cylinder on each side. One fed the steam end of the Worthington feed water pump, and the last fed the Westinghouse cross-compound air pump far ahead of the pilot deck. I opened the feed to the air pump, and then the pump itself turned on. Slowly, the pump came to life. Hardly any steam was being used to run the compressor, and its thumps came slowly. Up front, the compressor had several small copper tubes that served as condensate drains. I opened these, and the condensed water and steam issued forth from the exhaust tube up beside the stack as the rate of the compressor increased. The pump was started slowly to allow the pistons to warm up and to become well lubricated. Then I closed the condensate lines and turned the pump valve on full. Thump, thump, thump. The compressor's pounding could be felt through the frame of the locomotive. I watched the air pressure gauges to monitor the progress of the airflow to each air reservoir, one on each side of the running boards and one for service and the other auxiliary. I checked the main steam gauge again, and it was nearing 250 pounds. Operating pressure just below pop-off level. When the safety valves did pop, it was an ear-splitting hiss as steam shot skyward and mixed with the gray clouds and falling rain. With the compressor thumping and the steam from the blower rushing up the stack, the J2 was finally alive, ready for the run. Time to cut out the blower and let exhaust steam up the nozzles to induce the draft. I sat again in the cab, thinking how easy this all had been. As the engineer, Mr. Gooch, mounted the cab, he glanced at me with apparent disdain. I was new, and I had not worked out of Nashville. We had never met. He checked the steam pressure and water, fiddled with the lubricator, and then mumbled a muffled hello to me. extending a gloved hand without even looking me in the face. I'd been told that this fellow was a longtime NC engineer, something like 35 years. I'd read the requisite locomotive catechisms and texts. My book reading taught me about how the engine and the accessories operated. I understood firing theory, locomotive management, and I'd passed the rules of operating department, fireman, and air brake examinations. I'd served out the required 90-day probation under instruction, mostly on old consolidations and 10-wheelers, and the occasional Mikado. Now I was ready to give my book smarts and training a real test. After we'd coupled onto our train, the conductor climbed up into the cab with the head-end set of train orders. We'd get more orders at Brewston, and depending on changes to meets or times, we'd get reissued orders hooped up on the fly, or from the station agent at a scheduled stop. We read them silently, and then the hoghead quoted them out loud to the satisfaction of the conductor. Finally came the traditional time check, whereby we all compared watches. We were figuring on an 8-hour, 30-minute run to Memphis. Mr. Gooch pulled the whistle cord twice, indicating we were about to move ahead. At the moment he knocked off the air brake and pulled the throttle out, I turned off the blower. This saved steam because the exhaust from the engine would now draw the gases from the fire. I had already turned on the lubricator feeds for the steam chests and cylinders, so oil would be forced to them. We began to roll, tightening the slack, and as we did, I looked with shocked eyes at the steam gauge. Welcome to a fireman's nightmare. The nice head of 250 pounds I'd generated began to dwindle fast as the engine moved down the track, down to 190. No problem, I thought. I'll just crack the blower slightly, creating a more robust fire. This worked for a while, but when we came to Dixon, 2 miles west of Colesburg, and I looked at the water glass, I thought I was in serious trouble. I was down to 1 nut on the glass. While the pressure had increased back to 220 pounds, she needed water fast. No water to cover the top of the firebox was risking a boiler explosion. When the hogger closed the throttle, I cracked the blower and shut off the lubricator. At that instant, the feed water pump kicked in and began delivering water from the tender via the feed water heater to the check valve on the side of the boiler. Time and the experience of other firemen had shown where the pump throttle worked best, and that setting had been clearly scribed as a reference mark. The sound of the water entering the boiler mixed with the sound of the rain that began to pelt the cab roof. We were back up to 2 nuts, but the cold water entering the boiler had dropped steam pressure precipitously. The engineer peered over at me from his side of the cab. We didn't have enough steam to move the train. I scrambled to get the pressure back up. The stoker had done its job. The fire was hot, level, and properly layered with coal, and soon we had the needed pressure to continue, but 5 minutes off the advertised. To keep ahead of the competition, the NC expected crews to adhere to the timetable. With 2 pulls on the whistle cord, the hogger eased out the throttle, and I closed the blower and restarted the lubricators. The fire was really going now. The raging fire was so hot that when we came to the next stop, Johnsonville, 17 miles short of Brewston, where I took water from the standpipe and then cleared the fire and dumped clinkers into the pit near the Tennessee River Bridge, the pressure began to rise out of control. I knew if I didn't do something, the safeties would let go in earnest. This, along with heavy smoke, were the cardinal sins of NC&StL firemen. If the pop valves blow incessantly at a stop, huge amounts of valuable superheated steam are ejected into the atmosphere, steam that took hard work and fuel to produce, fuel that cost the company a lot of money. There was only one thing to do. Since the water level had dwindled down to 1 nut again, I could manually pump, which would bring the pressure down. I started the feed water pump, and while I got the pressure to drop, I also managed to put in a couple of nuts of water. Finally, everything was where it was supposed to be. Pressure, water level, and fire. As we began to move again, I sat in the left-hand seat, mentally exhausted. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I hung my head out the window and noticed the spray of rain as I admired the sun, now poking through the clouds. Rain and sun at the same time. Interesting weather. Somehow I felt Mr. Gooch's glare boring into the back of my head. I had a sinking feeling. I turned and looked at the glass. The water level was so high that I couldn't see the meniscus. "What in the hell were you thinking, boy?" the hoghead shouted. "When we were stopped at Johnsonville, we were on a downhill grade toward the river. Your water looked low because all the water sloshed forward, out of the sight glass. When you manually pump feed water, you put way too much in. Let that pump do its job. It'll keep the water level right, much better than you or I can." That explained the rain. Water from the boiler was being sucked through the throttle valve into the dry pipe and through the superheater before making its way through the cylinders and up the stack. The real rain had stopped for the moment, but I was being sprayed by water from our own engine. As we rolled down the track, I could hear the reverse lever rattling in the engineer's quadrant. As the water went through the valves and cylinders, it washed out the lubricants. The piston valves were dangerously close to scraping metal against metal, and the vibrations were making their way from the valves, through the Walschaerts valve motion, through the link, and ultimately to the various appliances in the cab. This confirmed it. Things were not going well for me on this, my first run with the training wheels off, and with a sweetheart of a locomotive. At mid-afternoon, the real rain began to fall. I got drenched to the skin at Brewston when I went to fill the tank with water, take on several tons of coal, and oil around again. I thought that surely this is the way it must have been years ago when my Uncle Leonard did the same thing on the old Nashville and Chattanooga. What would he have done? I wasn't going to let any wet clothes bother me. Besides, I knew that in the heat of the cab, my clothes would dry quickly. We continued on, and soon Engineer Gooch slowed to blow down over the Hatchie River bottom after stopping at Jackson to drop 4 cars of lumber. This meant he was about to expel all the sludge that was left in the boiler after the water had been turned to steam. This sediment, if allowed to build up, could seriously damage the boiler. The engineer opened the blowdown valve. It was located outside, below the cab, but the valve wheel was located in the cab. He shouted, "How much water we got, boy?" I yelled back, "4 nuts." With that, he opened the blowdown for 10 seconds, and a deafening eruption of superheated water flashed instantly to steam, shooting off the side about 50 feet from the engine. "How much water now?" 3.5 nuts. Soon we were down to 2 nuts with the pressure at 250 pounds. The fire looked good. I realized then that with the fire and the water right, steam pressure would level off right at 250, practically on its own. As we continued toward Memphis, things got better and better. It became a rhythm, and keeping the rhythm was as challenging to me as it might have been for a jazz musician. Keeping the engine hot, the water level just right, and the pressure just below pop-off was a challenge that I soon began to understand and actually enjoy. to open up to me, explaining that firing a locomotive like this is simple as long as you maintain the cycle, pressure gauge, water level, and fire. And that small adjustments are better than big ones. Make sure you keep the lubricator working right. It'll save you from a breakdown more often than not. He reminded me that with superheated engines, you want to keep the water level as safely low as possible. And finally, on an engine like this, with all kinds of modern appliances to free the fireboy from exhausting manual labor, he should have ample time to keep a close watch ahead from the left side of the cab, especially around curves. My book learning was quickly becoming practical knowledge. We arrived at Memphis about 5 p.m. The rain was really pouring now, and we had time for a small dinner break before shutting down the 569. I got my franks and beans from the service kitchen on the Memphis Union Station property and brought them back to the cab. I had the air compressor steam cracked, and the pump still panted every now and then as steam leaked past the valves and pushed down on the pistons. The engine still felt alive. I had a thin spot fire in the firebox, just enough to keep some steam up. 3 nuts in the glass. The cab was warm, and occasionally drops of rain would blow in through the open window, only to sizzle away to nothingness when they struck the hot metal of the backhead. The small bare light bulb reflected back from the brass rim of the steam gauge. After dinner, and after the last of the freight was switched out, we backed the J2 into the small Memphis engine house. The feed pump would make sure there was enough water in the boiler for the next time she'd be fired up. No need to use the injectors. I turned off the blower and compressor. The engineer opened up the cylinder cocks so any steam entering the cylinders through the throttle valve would not build up and cause the engine to move on its own. He closed the throttle and put the reverse lever straight up in the quadrant, in the neutral position. Chains were put up under the driving wheels to prevent any movement. The engine was quiet now. She made no sound at all. Slowly, the pressure dropped. 150 pounds, 100, 75, 50, 25. Now she didn't even have enough pressure to move herself. I walked around and opened up the condensate lines. The engineer had walked outside, so it was just the locomotive and me. I climbed into the cab once more. I tapped her steam gauge, now showing 0. The needle rose slightly and then fell back to its pin. Then I gave number 569 a good pat on the backhead, climbed down from the cab and signed her over to the engine house foreman. While it may have been a shaky start for me, I felt a real sense of Tennessee pride here at the end of the run. "Hey there, Moore," someone behind me called. It was the engineer, Mr. Gooch. He'd waited around for me to finish shutting her down. I was on my way to a cheap hotel room, a hot bath, and a good night's sleep before my deadhead back to Jackson. As we walked away from the Memphis Union Station, he said, "You know, we just happen to need a good fireboy off the extra board for regular work. Someone who knows how to keep an engine like this hot. You sure as hell earned your pay this trip, and you just might have learned a few things also. You up for it?" You can bet I was, and I ended my career as a Louisville and Nashville hoghead 38 years later. Doss Moore's story was originally published in the spring 2021 issue of Classic Trains magazine and used by permission of Kalmbach Media Company. This special presentation has been brought to you by Nashville Steam, a non-profit organization restoring Nashville's very own steam locomotive, number 576, a sister engine to the one featured in Doss Moore's story. The sights, sounds, and experiences in this great recollection are designed to come alive once again. And through Nashville's efforts, the magic of steam railroading will return to Music City and Middle Tennessee. You can support the restoration of 576 with a donation at NashvilleSteam.org and watch our progress by subscribing on YouTube.